So what's the scheduler do? Well, it's actually doing the exact same thing the kubelet's doing. It's issuing one of these requests, a watch request. So it is saying watch on pods. So it's getting all these pod objects. Whenever someone posts a pod object to the API server, the API server is going to send that out to the kubelets that are listening, send it out to the scheduler. The scheduler's job is also it's going to keep an eye on these node objects. So node objects are very similar to pod objects, except I mean they're just a bunch of YAML, but they describe a node. So they're like they're more static. You have one per VM essentially, and they describe some aspects related to that VM. So they have information, the VM name. They have things like how much CPU is available on that VM. That might be updated every now and again. Things like that is lives inside the node object. So the scheduler is watching both of these types of objects, and it is looking for pod objects that do not have a node name specified. So it's looking for uh, node name being empty, and it's saying, "Oh, if that's true, then I'm going to run some calculations. Fire up my Excel sheet and decide which node to throw this pod on." And then all it does is it issues basically a request, and it updates the pod. And what does it update it with? It just sets basically puts name or node name equal to something. So in this case, let's say it set it to worker one. So then this pod object got updated after I originally submitted it, and that's where this flow starts taking effect. So the kubelet is running, and it's listening for all pods, but it doesn't always run a. It's not always going to run the container, right? Because what if the container's already running? And that's why we actually call it a controller, is because it's running something called a control loop. And a control loop is really nothing more than a loop that doesn't exit, and it's trying to always set the state equal to some desired state. So there's some loop in here, so it's like forever, like basically saying maybe there's some function, and we'll call it reconcile, and this takes in, let's say, something like a pod name, or let's just say it takes in a pod. And what does that function do? Well, it says something along the lines of, this is some pseudocode, but uh, Docker PS, and maybe grep for the image, and says like, oh, okay, like, does that exist? Uh, if not, so if like not running, so maybe running is like, I don't know. This isn't really like, I'm making up this pseudocode as we go along, but you kind of get the idea. So if it's not running, then we know we need to Docker run the image. And that's the whole concept of this function. It is reconciling the fact that a pod says that an image should be there and should be on this node, with the fact that image may or may not be running, and it's trying to make the state of that node match what the pod said the state should be. So that's a part of Kubernetes too, is that you'll hear this term, Kubernetes is declarative. We don't tell Kubernetes what to do. We tell Kubernetes what we want. We say we want a container running, and that's what the pod object is declaring. So the mechanism that reconciles what we want with what's actually happening, typically we call a control loop or a reconciler or a controller. And that's exactly what the kubelet is. So the kubelet is a controller, and this is the loop that it's running. Every time there's an update to a pod, every time there's a new pod or a pod gets deleted, this reconcile function will get called, and then it will run its loop. Um, the scheduler is just another type of controller as well. Scheduler has a loop running in here, and this loop is controlling for pods that don't have node names. and trying to make sure that all the pods have node names assigned. So if it sees a pod that's empty, it's always trying to fulfill uh, its goal of filling in the node name for every pod. So that in that case, the scheduler is really just another controller. Um, and you can kind of fill in the blanks over here